Good morning, everyone. I hope all of you are doing well. We want to get started here with, just saying thank you for taking time out of your schedules to be a part of this meeting this morning. Jules, if you would like to, kind of explain the format for this morning. And then we'll introduce our guest.
Good morning, everyone. We have a great lineup for you all today. Thank you for being here. How this is going to work is we are going to introduce each one of our speakers individually. They're going to be able to present for about 10 minutes about their individual work, and then we are going to open up with all three of them. We're going to start with some guiding questions for our conversation today. And once we have gone through those few questions that we have developed, we're also going to be taking questions from you all that you put in the chat bar. So as you are hearing things and going along, please make sure that you put your questions in there, and Sky will be moderating it. We do have just a few ground rules. If you could keep yourselves on mute while the presentations are going on, that would be great. And remember, we're all human. We may have different reactions to the things that are going on. So let's moderate our own responses to the things that we might hear. But of course we will, because we're all great colleagues together. And with that, I think and also make sure to introduce yourselves and where you're from in the chat bar, so we know who you are and who we are talking with. Does that sound like everything, Dr. Carter?
Sounds good. I'll go ahead now and introduce our first speaker. Our first speaker is Sherry Scarborough, who is the author of African-American Railroad Workers of Roanoke, Oral Histories of the Norfolk and Western, 2014. Has over 30 years experience in oral and public history. She holds degrees from the University of Texas at Austin. She has contracted with numerous institutions over the course of her career, including the National Institutes of Health, the Library of Congress, NASA Johnson Space Center, the Library of Congress, the University of Virginia, the National Museum of Women in the Arts, and the Philadelphia Museum of Art. One of her recent projects involved interviews with former students of the Lee Buckner School, a Rosenwald school in Tennessee conducted for the Heritage Foundation of Williamson County, Tennessee. She is currently working on a book about Southwestern Virginia's civil rights icon and community leader, Nan B. Hairston, 1921 to 2017, which is based on a series of oral history interviews she conducted with Mrs. Hairston.
Okay. Oh, should I begin or?
Yes, please.
Okay. Okay. Change my view. Speaker. Okay. I'm going to share my screen. I'm going to try to make sure that I can. Okay, sorry, folks. As I've already mentioned this morning to the group putting this on, I'm really not a morning person, but I'm going to do the best that I can here. Slideshow. And I've done a webinar recently. It's so odd not to hear anything, not to see other people's faces, or when I may, say a joke or something, there's no response. So it's very odd to give a webinar rather than a talk. So here we go. And I apologize in advance for having a PowerPoint, but I am just not a good off-the-cuff speaker, and I need to have something to tie me to reality and not just to go off on some tangent. So I believe in the power of story and its ability to change lives and the world. It's actually been my life's work. I was honored to have been entrusted with the stories I'm going to briefly touch on today, and very pleased to be able to pass some of the history and wisdom from my narrators to you in their own words, as oral historians do. My book, which has just been mentioned, is based on an oral history project I conducted the year before. I was hired by the Historical Society of Western Virginia in league with the Virginia Museum of Transportation here in Roanoke to do it. As many of you may know, Roanoke is one of America's great rail centers, and it was the original headquarters for Norfolk and Western Railway. African Americans have a long history with the railroad, a history that began before the Civil War, when enslaved people helped construct tracks across the country and exist to the present day. African Americans played an important role in the history of NNW and Norfolk Southern as well. That role has evolved over time as laws have changed and doors of opportunity have opened. My interviewees came from a group of NNW retirees and Norfolk and Southern employees, a group called the Norfolk and Western African American Heritage Group. I conducted 20 interviews and was able to include excerpts from 12 of those oral histories in my book. The book tells the story of these railroaders whose careers span the years from Jim Crow to the Civil Rights Movement to institutional diversity programs. And it tells the story in their own words, as I've said. Some of the stories are the stories of pioneers who paved the way to today's more level playing field. And some are the stories of their children and grandchildren who've become the engineers, conductors, and corporate managers, positions that were denied to the earlier generations. And in many cases, in telling their own stories, they tell the stories of their father or grandfather who worked for the railroad and their mother or grandmother who urged them on and supported them. It is the seemingly never-ending story of African Americans in this country: struggle, resilience, and sometimes triumph. As you might expect, powerful themes emerged from the interviews, themes concerning a thriving African American community in Roanoke that sadly in some ways no longer exists, the strong role the railroad and the Black railroad man played within this community, the power of education, a strong work ethic, and the importance of self-respect and giving back to the larger community. I'm going to share some photos now that Norfolk Southern allowed me to use for my book, and most of these are taken in Roanoke. This is the passenger station. You can see these gentlemen show you what the dignified railroad man looked like, you know, dressed, shoes nice, that kind of thing. The wheel rollers, that's in Roanoke. Al Holland, one of my key participants and prime movers of the project, told me, "We made cotton, but we took that cotton and made silk." Cotton to Silk was actually the name of the project. We took the name of our oral history project from Mr. Holland's words. What he meant here was that when he was hired by the railroad in 1938, there were only certain jobs available to African Americans. These were cleaners, crewmen, brakemen, porters, cooks, and waiters. Mr. Holland was hired as a janitor and retired 46 years later as an assistant manager in tariff compilations. They were low-paying jobs compared with other railroad positions available only to white employees, but they were the best-paying jobs that African Americans could get at the time. He remembers the railroaders took what they could get and made lives for themselves and their families. They bought homes, sent their children to school, and were leaders in their communities. They were the office holders of the NAACP, the scout leaders, and ministers. Eventually, after passage of the Civil Rights Act in 1964, They were able to bid on other jobs in the company and move up in the hierarchy to become clerks, machinists, supervisors, conductors, engineers, and even vice presidents. J.R. Hughes told me about his father, who was an N&W porter, and the other railroad men. Black men who worked for the railroad in this town, most of them didn't have any formal education. Working for the railroad, they could live in a pretty good home, own a nice car, feed their families, and take care of them. The men worked on the railroad, supported their families, and went to church. These men gave us, railroad men's children, a certain dignity. They gave us a cut in our strut because they demanded that you acted like somebody. Reverend Carl Tinsley told me about how after 1964, he helped integrate N&W. From there, every time a job would come open, I'd go get a black and bring him in because at that time they were cutting blacks off. The freight station was closing down and the passenger station was cutting down. You had a lot of men who'd been working there 20, 25 years. I would tell them, they want to make us think that you can't, but anybody can file and do manual work. I think I maybe brought in 6. My idea was that if it was going to be integrated, we needed to start filling positions everywhere. I started it, and from there it started moving a little bit. It took a couple of years, but we had blacks in those positions. As you might imagine, bridging the time period between Jim Crow and 2013, there are quite a few firsts in this group. The first African-American machinist, the first clerk in freight traffic, the first supervisor of the East End shops, first police officer, engineer, and the first operational vice president, not only for Norfolk and Western, but for the entire railroad industry. There's a profound awareness that the people who came before them made their positions possible. This was so ably said by one of the interviewees, David Cobbs, who at the time was the assistant vice president for diversity. He said, "The Al Hollands of the world blazed the trail. They put up with stuff that probably I wouldn't have been able to put up with. By the time I got out here, for the most part, it was accepted that if you were Black, that you could make it out here. I think that's why I've been successful. Terry Evans, the vice president, has been successful, and any number of African Americans out there have been successful. They made the way better for me." The generation of African Americans who were hired after 1964 have gone on to hold the positions that had so long been denied to earlier generations. Engineer John Nutter shared a poignant memory. "So for approximately 30 plus miles, I operated the 611. And while I was doing that and riding through the countryside and waving out the windows and blowing the whistle, it came to me that at one time it was stated that a Black man would never touch the throttle of an engine on Norfolk and Western." There have been oral history projects and books that address the role African Americans have played in the building and maintaining of America's railroads, but none is focused on the Roanoke Valley or the Norfolk and Western until my book. It's my hope that this project and book help to document the lives and careers of African Americans living and working in Southwestern Virginia. I hope the project lives up to one of my younger interviewees, Mike Worrell's sentiment when he told me, "It's a good thing because everybody needs to hear it. Not only is it a story of them, it's actually a story of the railroad or how the railroad got to where they are at. Without those stories, there wouldn't be an America." And finally, back to David Cobbs, who said, "This is not just African American history, this is everybody's story." In addition to my book, another outcome of the Oral History Project is the updated and expanded African American installation at the Virginia Museum of Transportation. You can listen to the interviews and read excerpts from the transcripts. Please visit if you haven't already. Thank you so much, and I appreciate this opportunity to share these voices and their important stories. If you have any questions beyond today, please don't hesitate to contact me.
Thank you, Sherry. That was fascinating. What a great glimpse into that point in time. And I love what your last narrator said, that it isn't just Black American history, it is American history. I love that. Up next, and thank you. Up next, we have Emily Jones Hudson. She's a Hazard native, a graduate of Hazard High School in 1974 and Berea College in 1978 with a bachelor's degree in English. Emily was a reporter and women's editor for the Indianapolis Recorder and worked as a freelance writer in Cleveland, Ohio before going into health information management field in 1988. She worked for Appalachian Regional Healthcare for 26 years as a coder, auditor, and educator, and currently part-time for Harmony Healthcare Solutions in Tampa, Florida as a remote auditor in education. Overall, 33 years in the HIM field. Emily is also an ordained minister, founder and senior pastor of Common Bond Christian Fellowship Ministries located in Hazard. And she also serves as a chaplain for Hazard Regional Medical Center. She is the author of 2 inspirational books, Water Walking Faith, Author House Publishing 2009, and Touch the Helm, Zulon Press 2015, and a collection of poetry and prose called Soul Miner, that's Zulon Press 2017. Publication credits include works in Club Date Magazine, Appalachian Heritage, Kudzu, the Kentucky Coal Journal, Reshaping the Image of Appalachia, edited by Loyal Jones, and the Kentucky Folklife Magazine. Please welcome Emily Jones Hudson.
Thank you for that introduction, and it's an honor to be able to serve on this panel. We're talking about everything that we all love, history and culture and telling the stories. And I think telling the stories is the important thing. I was involved in oral history projects back in the 80s and early 90s, and interviewed quite a few people, and all of that got put on the back burner, on the shelf. These stories, and most of the people that I had interviewed had passed on and gone on, but I'm the holder of their stories, and so it's like they were taken off the shelf, like the time is now, and to share their stories. We started the Southeast Kentucky African-American Museum and Culture Center in I think the fall of 2020. We are waiting on a physical site to be completed, and but in the meantime, we're working on projects and collecting stories about Blacks in Appalachia, in particular Southeast Kentucky. The comment that was made, African-American history is Appalachian history, and it is. When looking at the history of the African-American Appalachia, you have to tell the overall story of Appalachia, history in Appalachia, and then how we, intersected in that. But the problem has been that the story of the African-American in Appalachia has not been told. We're all aware of that. We start off by saying history is made by the people, belongs to the people, and is told by the people. However, the history of African-Americans in Southeast Kentucky have been untold. It's like a chapter being left out of a book. And so our purpose is to explore, recover, and preserve the rich history and culture of African Americans in Southeast Kentucky, and to display and share their stories through displays of artifacts, exhibitions, and media presentations, and to host workshops that will bring people together to have discussions about some of the issues that are going on. So we want to engage the community and in learning about the history of African Americans in Southeast Kentucky. As we break ground, so to speak, with our work of collecting stories that sheds light on Black life and living in the mountains of Southeast Kentucky, we find that they have left footprints in about every arena of life: education, farming, mining, business, medical, housing. I was in a conversation with the group yesterday, and we were sharing history about how Blacks owned businesses, here in the 30s and 40s, and a lot of people don't remember or don't know that. And so we're collecting those stories and bringing those names of those businesses, back out. So we find that they've left footprints in about every arena of life. And if we don't make public these stories, this history, then it would be like someone takes a branch and wipes away the footprints of our ancestors, and no one will ever know they were here or what they did contribute to the growth that took place during that time. And that phrase really sticks in my mind. I hear it going on and on a lot. They were here. They were here. We're working on a cemetery project called History Speaks from the Grave, where we go into cemeteries, locate, identify sites where African Americans are buried. And we want to document the names and research their lives to tell as much as their story as possible. And when I walk through these sites, it's like I hear the voice of those who are buried. And long ago, they're whispering, "Tell them I was here. Tell them I was here." And I think that is the echo I hear throughout our region and Appalachia overall. Because according to the media and the written history, there was not an African-American presence here. Recently, like our work, we're based in Perry County, but our work also extends into the 4 other counties that touch our borders. And we recently went into a county where most people, there aren't many Black people that live there. It may be, you can count them on one hand. And, but there is a history there that no one, knows about. So we went over there and, to talk about, we went to visit one of the cemeteries and talk about the history there. And the presence it's in the cemeteries right now. But so we're going to try to get that history out. But they don't know, they know that there was a Black presence there. They didn't know that the newspaper that is there today, in operation today, was started by a Black man. So there's things that are not known, but we're trying to uncover and present so that their voice, tell them I was here, tell them I was here. And I think that we share that in common, discovering, recovering, preserving, and sharing these stories, this history. One of the, and tell them I was here, one of the biggest industries in our area has been the coal industry, coal mining. And, we can look back. Coal discovered in Kentucky in 1750, first commercial coal mine in 1820. Coal mining had such a big impact in our region. And it also, the economic impact, it's like I saw tentacles going out from the mining industry, and it touched all these other businesses and so forth. So it had a big economic impact. The African American played a big role in the coal industry, as we know. The coal industry is what drew a lot of African Americans to Kentucky, and in particular, East and Southeast Kentucky. The railroad made its way into my area in our county in 1912. And, you know, before that, people didn't travel a lot. There was a logging industry that was going on, and they had to take the logs in a boat downriver, you know, to get them to where they needed to go. But when the railroad came in, it just kind of opened up opportunity for growth. Coal companies sent trains to southern states, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and Tennessee, recruited men to work in their mines. And many answered the call, including African Americans looking for a better life. And that's how my grandfather on my dad's side, he came to Kentucky to work in the mines. He came, was born in at Georgia, and was in Tennessee for a while. Their family, there was a tornado, not a hurricane, but a tornado that came through Pruden, Tennessee, and wiped that town out. And so he ended up catching the train, going to Southeast Kentucky to find a job in the mines, and then sent back for his family. So that's how a lot of them got to the coal fields. They came and populated coal camp towns where they did not own the house, but they lived in, nor did they own the land. The coal companies that came in, and I'll say they saw the opportunity of what was there, but they owned and provided for everything: healthcare, place to worship, place to go to school, place to buy food and goods. You may have heard about the coal camp in Lynch, Kentucky. It was the model coal camp. They had over 10,000 homes, coal camp homes, and it was just the biggest concentration of folks, including Black miners. Miners were paid scrip that can only be used in coal company commissary. The coal camps were mostly segregated, with Blacks living in one end of the hollow and whites living in the other end of the hollow. Separate schools, separate worship, separate playgrounds. But when the men went into the mines, they went in the morning different colors, but they came out in the evening the same, covered in black soot and coal dust. Some statistics. When you think about the coal mining industry in Kentucky, in 1900, there was a total of 9,299 miners, and there was 2,200 Black miners. As we look at the decades as it went on, in 1910, 18,000, it jumped to 18,000 miners, with 3,888 Black miners. 1920, 44,269 miners, 7,400 Black miners. 1930, it went even higher, 54,000 miners, with 7,300 Black miners. And then we see in the 40s, there was 54,600 miners, and then 5,473 Black miners. And then we see in 50 overall miners, 64,000, but the Black miners went down 2,900. And 60, in 1960, it go down even more. What we see in there is the big demand. You know, in the coal industry, there's always been the boom and the bust, the boom and the bust. Coal was booming around World War I and World War II, when the demand was so high. And but when that demand went down, when machines started to be used to replace miners, when all of that began to happen, then the miners left. Many of them left the region, and that's Black and white. Many of them left the region to look for jobs in the north, in northern cities. This is also when we began to see what I would call a dramatic drop in African-American population in our region. Many left due to lack of employment opportunities, and we see this still happening today with our young people leaving the area due to lack of jobs. So the question for me becomes, what can we do to keep this generation here, or entice those who have left to return and contribute to our growing region? One of the things that I'm seeing in our region is the attempt to revive and revitalize life in small towns through tourism. And it's kind of ironic. Once stripping and abusing the land's natural resources and beauty, now trying to promote what has been here all along. But it is an opportunity for African Americans to shout, "I'm still here." And I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. Thank you. That was wonderful. Let me introduce our last speaker for today, Dr. Tom Lee, who graduated with a BA from East Tennessee State University, received a Master of Arts from Wake Forest University, and received a doctoral degree from the University of Tennessee at Knoxville. He is taught at the University of Tennessee at Knoxville, Roane State Community College, and ETSU, where he is currently an associate professor of history. He also teaches courses on Tennessee, the South, Appalachia, populism, the progressive era, the agrarian ideal in America, and public history. In 2005, the University of Tennessee Press published his book, The Tennessee, Virginia Tri-Cities Urbanization in Appalachia, 1900 to 1950. He is currently working on a history of early tobacco in Southern Appalachia. Dr. Lee, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Carter. When I was asked to participate today, the general guidelines I was given, I was to sort of provide a contextual frame, which is probably the easiest thing for me to do in some ways, and also the hardest in the amount of time that we have. So I'll do my best to stay within the guidelines for time. But I often do an experiment with students, and I ask them to envision a term. You know, I'll throw out a term and I'll say, close your eyes, and say, what do you see, after giving them just a second, you know, to get that image in their heads. And I do that a lot of times with farmer. And the idea is that oftentimes when people are asked to just, you know, respond quickly to a term and create an image in their mind, what they come up with when you say farmer is a male, and often white. That's the imagery. It neglects, when we begin to discuss that image, it neglects the degree to which women have participated in the operation of farms, the ownership of farms, the running of farms. But it also, of course, it reminds us of the lack of recognition to which all sorts of different people have been connected with farming. And the same thing is true, of course, for Appalachia. For the longest time, I think when people thought of Appalachia and they thought about the Appalachian stereotype, of course, they thought about Appalachian whites. And that whiteness and the fact that part of what's been left out of the larger story is the diversity, I think is very revealing. Because what it reveals is some of the mechanisms that have been at work through the history of this region. And both of the previous two panelists have mentioned elements of this and what they've said. So in some ways, I feel like I'm being redundant. But just to provide a fairly quick overview, I want to drop back in thinking about labor in Appalachia and diversity, and just very quickly go all the way back to the antebellum period, before the Civil War. In Tennessee, and I teach Tennessee history, there's evidences of the presence of slaves with some of the earliest encounters between Euro-Americans, Europeans, and Native Americans. And we sometimes forget the degree to which the Native American part has a role in this Appalachian story. But there were African Americans who were part of the story of the movement of Tennesseans from East Tennessee to Middle Tennessee and the settlement of the Cumberland settlements. We know from the story of the state of Franklin that one of the elements of the story is John Sevier and slavery. The presence of slaves here on the frontier in East Tennessee, even in the colonial period and then the period of the early republic. In terms of labor, of course, the thing that most often comes to mind is slavery. But in terms of the diversity that's involved there, I think we fail to appreciate the sort of variations that slavery took. And by that, I mean, it's field hands certainly, but particularly in Appalachia, where slavery was practiced fully. Slaves often didn't work so much in the gang labor system as they worked within smaller units, even sometimes familial units, but also the degree to which slavery was a way to make money in industry. And so I'm reminded that even before the Civil War, we had instances of slaves operating under Elihu Embry, for instance, maybe very well participating in the iron industry. We know that there were slaves participating in the salt industry in Appalachia, both in Saltville, Virginia, here close by, but also in the Kanawha River Valley to the north in West Virginia and elsewhere. We know that slaves were hired out, and what makes slavery operate there is that the masters got the wages effectively. And that sets a tone. And so I kind of wanted to talk briefly about this concept. Once slavery ends and we move into Reconstruction, and we move into this postbellum period, not only in Appalachia, but in the South, for me, thinking about labor, crucial to this concept is the idea that the South as a whole was what we would call an isolated labor market. During Reconstruction, once we have the freemen, once we have emancipation, we have almost immediately efforts to control the freedom of the freedmen. And a lot of that is economic, because the demand is for control of labor, to keep populations who have been enslaved close to the farm, close to agriculture in the South, in places like the Mississippi Delta and Alabama and elsewhere. We know that you have, for instance, in Reconstruction, the Black Codes, which are laws passed which force freedmen into labor contracts on a yearly basis. We have anti-enticement laws, which are designed to keep competitors from offering higher wages, to wage labor, to draw labor away, to keep wages low in the South. And all of these legal means remind us that there were laws being passed at the state level, at the county level, which were designed to coerce and to limit the freedom that the freedmen had to sell their labor. And that's crucial to the idea of a free labor market. It's what the Republicans were on about when they talked about free labor in the 1850s. But besides the legal means, we have to remember there are also extra legal means, other modes of coercion. And during Reconstruction, of course, we could talk about the Klan, we could talk about other instances of violence, and what will emerge in the postbellum period writ large, of course, would be things like lynching. And that could happen not only for just arbitrary reasons, but often it could mean, it could be connected with labor, effort by someone to sell their labor, to get more, even to leave a plantation. Now, tied to this business of coercion, and I know I'm moving too quickly probably and not making a lot of sense, but just hang on, is the issue of race. Frederick Law Olmsted, in one of the great sort of efforts to talk about race in Appalachia and slavery, he tours the area in the 1850s, and what he reports is a population he reports the presence of slavery clearly, but a population that ultimately doesn't particularly care for the institution of slavery, especially up in the mountains. But they're also no great friend of the idea of freedom for African Americans. There are racial overtones. And in this postbellum period, those racial overtones are transferred and they're connected with labor in the region. And here's what I mean by that. If we look at the types of labor opportunities that evolve across the South and in Appalachia as well, particularly in Appalachia, they are extractive. That's to say that they're going after natural resources. And in these types of industries, along with certain manufacturing industries like wood-related products industries, textiles, etc., one of the crucial differences between profit or a lack of profit could be the cost of labor. And so it behooves these industries to keep labor costs down. And ultimately what they'll end up doing, and why I think diversity and the part that African Americans have played not only in a positive way, but through this other mechanism that I'm kind of focused on, the reason it's so important is because it helps to shape Southern and Appalachian industry. The maintenance of low wages can be achieved in part by legal means, as with Reconstruction, and also extra legal means. Segregation becomes a mechanism for keeping wages low and keeping control over labor. In the postbellum period, by the 1880s and particularly the 1890s, we see African Americans being brought in, as was mentioned earlier actually, induced to move to the mountains to work in the coal industry. We see labor agents on the docks in places like Philadelphia and New York who are bringing Russians and Italians and other immigrants directly into the mountains. Once they're in the mountains, if it's railroad work or sawmill work or whatever it may be, they may not speak the language, probably don't. They're in a place they've never been before. They're away from other populations, other people that may be familiar with their culture. And in a way, there is an automatic insecurity there. Where do you go? If you're not happy with the work, if you're being mistreated, where do you go? If you're out in the middle of nowhere, where do you go? Consider that many of the coal mining towns or camps that are created where the coal is not near population centers, but out and away from people. We also see segregation in the camps. And in part, the maintenance of segregation is in keeping with cultural norms of the time, but it's also linked to keeping race as a wedge to prevent people with common interests from joining together to seek some solution for their problem. And it really boils down, for instance, in the coal areas, it boils down to keeping unions out a lot of times and keeping control over the coal operators' property. Race becomes that wedge issue. Diversity becomes a wedge issue. And that's a huge part of the story of Appalachia. It's the stereotype too easily forgets this notion that African Americans, that Italians, that Hungarians, Romanians, people from Eastern Europe were brought into the coal fields, that they moved into the area for lots of different reasons, lots of different populations. Part of the reason for forgetting, part of the reason for that erasure is the centrality that diversity played in this larger story. And I've made a real hash of it in my 10 minutes, and I'm sorry about that. But I hope at least the general idea is there, that in many ways, what we see playing out in Appalachia, while it is distinct, is also part of a larger operation of forces that we see not only in the South, but in America broadly. So I'll go ahead and stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Lee. That was wonderful. Jules, would you like to jump in here?
Sure. Thank you so much. And Tom, we followed along with you wonderfully. Thank you for providing that brilliant context and so many different ways to think about labor here and how we got to where we got, and taking us back to those very earliest instances. So thank you for enlightening us with that. We'd like to open up now, and this is with all three of our speakers. We've developed a few questions that we'd like to ask you, and I'd also like to ask our participants who are joining us on the webinar online today to start putting some thoughts or ideas that you would like our speakers to talk about in the chat bar. Sky will keep track of those. And as you are thinking and coming up with some questions, we've got a couple that we'd like to start out with. And one of the questions that we were wanting to maybe explore a little more thoroughly is talking about the difference of the work we do in this region now, as opposed to 50 years ago. How has it changed? How has it really changed? And we've heard a little bit about the Civil Rights Act of 1964 that opened some of those doors, but I think we'd love to hear a little bit more about how those roles have changed and how labor has changed. And I'll let any of you begin, whichever of our speakers wants to begin, may just go for it.
If I may, very quickly, I don't want to take this to tangentially, but I'd like to go back to something that Ms. Hudson said in regard to what happened, for instance, with coal in the 20th century, very quickly. There is an absolute shift that happens in the coal industry, really around the New Deal and World War II. And she was giving numbers and statistics, which are absolutely wonderful, because what they reflect in part is the transitioning of that industry toward greater mechanization, and also away from underground mining towards surface mining. It is important to note that African Americans were integral to a lot of the labor movements that we see from Birmingham, Alabama in the 1890s. There's a strike going on in Birmingham, I guess, right now, related to coal. But from Birmingham in the 1890s and on through the Paint Creek and Cabin Creek strikes in West Virginia and Blair Mountain, African Americans were integral to that. But what we actually see happening in coal is the transition to surface mining and mechanization actually leads to a lot of African Americans suffering what a lot of African Americans suffered in Southern industry, which is when shifts occur in the industry, African Americans are often the first pushed out. They're the first to go. And I think that's one of the transitions of the 20th century. But I think it also, we might consider looking at the types of industry we see now, because manufacturing in the region would also change the dynamic for African Americans as well.
Thank you for that.
I'll jump in. I'd like to say that I see a continuum, as Dr. Lee was talking about, using race as a wedge issue to prevent the coming together of the working class, to form unions, et cetera. It's still being used today. I mean, instead of changes, it seems like that has continued.
Yeah. Thank you, Tom, for giving some more in-depth picture about what happened with the coal industry, and how they went from underground to strip mining and mountaintop removal. And one of the things that with the mountaintop removal, after quite a few mountains had been leveled there, and we had all this flat space, they tried to, you know, revitalize that, planted grass and but I was reading how the soil, they wanted to plant trees, and you know, they had this picture of just blossoming back, but that did not, you know, happen in full. So they had the wide open places with the grass, and a few years ago they brought elk back into the region and released elk, and so that began that tourism, the tourism industry, and where people will come in during that season and hunt elk. There's a county that also on some of these strip mine sites or mountain removal sites, they have opened up a tourism event like horse riding and things like that, which has been you know, become very popular, drawing people into the area. Also, on some of these past mining sites, buildings have been built. They have to just make sure that the land is settled so that the buildings that they build on there don't begin to shift. But our hospital was built on a site. It comes down to life after coal. You know, people are hoping that, you know, coal revitalizes and comes back and so forth, but it's not going to come back to the full vigor that it, you know, it was in those early years. So life after coal, we have to look at that picture, and like I said, tourism, I think, is one of the things that is being looked at, you know, to help the region grow.
Thank you. And you know, that's a good place for us to go into the direction that I'm about to take you, and that is, you know, I'd like for all three of you to kind of talk to us just for a moment about work in regard to recreation, and you know, how that has changed the region. And we're thinking things like Old Butler and TVA, and you know, issues, you know, recreation around the Nolichucky or the Holston River. Can you, one or all of you, discuss a little bit of that and enlighten us there? Thank you.
I'm in a different region, so of course, I don't really know about the areas you're talking about, so I'm going to back out.
I'd be curious to know what sort of recreational opportunities. I think Smith Lake is up near Roanoke, is it not?
Smith Mountain Lake?
Smith Mountain Lake, that's what it is.
Yes, yes.
It's there are a lot of houses around the lake, if I recall correctly. Is that something that's been open, for instance, to railroad workers?
Well, you know, the people I was speaking with were talking about a time when really there was segregation, many of them. So they couldn't swim or go to any areas, you know, that they shared with whites. Smith Mountain Lake is very privately owned, as you just mentioned. I think there are a couple of public boat ramps and there's a state park there, but I'm not used to that kind of ownership around a lake, so that they're private homes. You really can't access it. The folks I spoke with, there was an African-American baseball league. I mean, there was recreation here, and segregated for the most part, you know, until, of course, the 70s. The schools really weren't even integrated here until the 70s. So yeah, I don't know anything specifically about Smith Mountain Lake. It's about 45 minutes away from Roanoke.
I was just doing that in terms of the TVA, which you mentioned, Dr. Carter. You know, one of the things that I'm always reminded of is the degree to which the TVA did not effectively alter many of the existing patterns in terms of employment. Oftentimes African Americans, not always, there are always exceptions to anything pretty much I'm going to say, but oftentimes African Americans would be hired on in, frankly, sort of menial jobs. They weren't necessarily going to be the engineers. They weren't going to necessarily be the contractors. It would be labor. If it's the offices, it might be a lower level job. It might be custodial, whatever, but that was often the case. And, you know, there's a real understanding that the New Deal, for instance, FDR's New Deal, it really didn't change a lot of patterns. In fact, often reinforced patterns. But it also created, with its lake construction in this area, a lot of opportunities for recreation, for people to fish. And that's intriguing in terms of the environmental side. But in terms of diversity and who has access, I know there might be someone that can speak to that better in terms of now. You know, who uses the state parks, the national parks that we have available? Who are they constructed for? Who are the ideas in mind when they were put together, as far as who would benefit? And I think a lot of that would probably go back to the stereotype out of Washington, you know, where you have planning and the headquarters and for the agency. So that would be my thought.
Thank you.
We've got a question by Stephen Nash that kind of folds into one of the last questions that we had. And I think it might be interesting to blend those. Stephen asks, what role does land speculation by the elites inside and beyond the region and landlessness play sorry, I'm trying to read it all, play in Appalachian labor history? And to connect with that and to piggyback on that, we were wondering what your thoughts were about the explosion of growth in Sevierville right now, and the tourism around it, and what you think it might do to the culture of the community there when you've got this influx of wealthy that are being served basically by a working class and lower class group of people who live there 365. So I see how those two kind of thoughts kind of dovetail, and you can answer one or both, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
I'd like to say something about the last part of that, about the Sevierville, and I am not, being up here in Southeast Kentucky, I'm not as you know, versed about what is going on there. I know I visit the area and I love the area, and but one of the things, you know, that question, one of the things that stuck out, what does it do to the culture with the constant influx of wealthy served by local blue collar and service workers? And immediately what came to mind when I saw that question, and it's something that Tom had mentioned as he was, it's one word that came out of that: control. Control. And it makes me think about a mindset, a pattern, you know, that goes all the way back into the days of enslavement. You had the plantation owner, and they had their enslaved labor. Control during Reconstruction, and you know, they wanted to maintain that control for their labor. They passed these laws that you know, would send African Americans to prison, and then they used the prison population to continue the work. And then when you think about the coal industry and you look at that relationship between the coal company owner and the coal miner, there's that element of control. They controlled everything. They controlled everything. And so that whole picture came to mind when I read part of that statement, the influx of wealthy served by local blue collar and service workers. There's an element of control where there's one group that takes advantage or gets the most out of the situation while the others labor and at what cost. So that was kind of the picture that I got there and the thoughts that I had on that.
Thank you. Would anybody else like to jump in on this question?
I'll throw in just a little bit. I can remember when Dollywood was Silver Dollar City, and there's an idea of the West that's represented at Silver Dollar City, much as there's an idea of Appalachia that's been represented at Dollywood. And that idea is often bound up with the stereotype that we talked about. But at the same time, if you bring that into the modern day, yeah, absolutely. It seems to me there is a sort of repetition of pattern that we see in the incoming service industry that supports the tourist coming into. I think a good question. I don't want to jump ahead, so if I am, Jules, let me know. But there's a question on down the chat in regard to how historic sites, museums, other institutions can have a role in kind of telling the story and helping people understand the dynamics that are at play. I think that these sites are crucial to engaging people to think more deeply about the consumption, and I'll use the term consumption specifically, the consumption of culture, because there's a form of cultural consumption. People often forget, out in the Ozarks, there was a park that was focused on Little Abner. If you're familiar with the comic strip, it was Dog Patch USA. Absolutely was focused on this stereotype, and it was the beginnings of what would grow into becoming Branson and that whole area, which is a massive tourist destination, just like in many ways Gatlinburg and Sevierville are. But I think besides that kind of more entertainment, and it is fascinating to me how Dollywood has mixed entertainment with that cultural play in their history. I think that's fascinating. But how they've done that, and how other sites that people visit, which are part of the larger tourist industry, for lack of a better term, that offer an opportunity to engage people in a lot deeper thinking about the dynamics at work. Not only where they are, but where they live when they come visit. And how viable, how is that in an economic sense? How much can you do? But I think people are actually often open to that kind of engagement. It makes the visit more interesting. It makes it more worthwhile. You come away feeling that you've taken something away with you, rather than just putt-putt. But beyond that, a couple other questions. One of them you mentioned it had to do with land and landlessness that Dr. Nash asked about. That's another crucial element in this. There was a question, and I'll shut up in a moment. But there's a question about a book where someone had worked in cotton and then also maybe worked in the mines. This relationship between agriculture and industry is crucial, really, to understanding the South and Southern labor, because the type of agriculture, whether it's sharecropping or the struggling agriculture that we see throughout the region, is often what helps to keep the types of industries coming that benefit from the lower wages. In other words, if your only other option is to farm and you're not surviving very well on the farm, then a regular paycheck, even if the wages are low, looks pretty good. And that's where that land and landlessness bit really comes in. People who had land and could hold on to it, often they played with the market, they played with credit and capital when it was to their advantage, but they tried to hold on to the independence of the land. And those that lost that independence often were forced more or less into seeking other forms of employment. And so land and landlessness becomes really important. And it's possible, in fact, it's quite often the case that in the earliest stages of industrialization, people would keep one foot on the farm and one foot in the factory because they were playing for security. And they always kind of thought maybe they'd go back to the farm if things improved. But gradually what we see is often people moving further and further into situations where they may not even be making enough, you know, to say for one family member to make a living. Textiles was often like that, where you had to have the entire family working to make a family wage. Wasn't necessarily the case in the mines where it was mostly male labor in the mine.
Well, I'd like to jump in on that just for a minute to talk a little bit about Roanoke and the railroaders I spoke with. As I mentioned, they were able to buy their homes. You know, this is pre-64. They bought homes. There are really prosperous neighborhoods here that were African Americans, and they were successful businesses. What happened, I believe it was the 60s, urban renewal happened, and they took out this whole successful business area downtown to put in the freeway. And so that, and talk about control, that's a very good point. So these businesses were wiped out and these communities were strangled. So they could no longer go to the black barber because that business was no longer there. I mean, there were nightclubs. We had like big named acts coming here. You know, all of that was demolished for progress. So I heard a lot of stories about that. I just wanted to jump in and share that.
I agree with you, Sherry, on that. That's what happened in my hometown. Blacks owned businesses, property, and you know, right now where the fire department stands, or there was a black high school, and when urban renewal came, they bought all the land. The black businesses disappeared. The black high school, it was taken down, torn down, so that housing projects could be constructed. And but it's the same kind of story, where you see blacks owning land, businesses, and so forth. But when that change came through, you know, that was no longer the story.
Thank you. I've heard several stories about how urban renewal has actually was not a renewal at all, but it was bringing back an old order. And that's an important thing to talk about. One of the other questions that we've got is these spaces to talk about this. I keep reflecting, Emily, on your words, we were here, and also of the people who are still here, we are here. And our cultural institutions are great places for these stories to emerge. Teresa says marginalized folks have so many things in common, including social and economic conditions. And what role can our, sorry, I'm trying to find out, what role can, what are the wedges that keep us from connecting with each other today? And how can our cultural and historic sites and community centers bring people together to discuss and tackle these issues? And as people who have collected oral stories and oral histories that are probably housed in these historic locations, what might you say about that?
Well, I mean, the first step, what happened to me, my experience is the Virginia Museum of Transportation, which is the statewide museum on railroads, had a very tiny space dedicated to African-American history with the railroads. It was very outdated. And that's one reason they brought me in to tell a fuller picture, tell the stories. And so now that installation has been expanded and updated. It's still, you know, segregated because it's still its own installation within the larger framework of the museum. So first you have to tell the stories before you can begin discussing and bringing people together. So that did happen. One nice thing about the Virginia Museum of Transportation, that's where the group, the retiree group meets weekly. African-American group meets at the museum to, they meet together, but is there anything here where it brings the whole community together? Once a year at the museum, they have a celebration and the whole community comes together, but it's not a place of questioning, talking about how to move things forward, as I believe the question was asking. But that's just my experience with this particular project.
Yeah, that's one of the things that our Museum and Cultural Center, one of our goals, and that is to bring people together and have conversations, because I think having the conversations is a key thing. When you say marginalized folks, and that you know, regardless of your ethnicity, your cultural background, you're marginalized, and there's things that you share in common. But we can get to the things that you share in common. And like I used to say, give the picture that I have, it really helps me to see some things is when you go to a dinner at say a white family's home, and they're having soup, beans, and cornbread and onions, you know, and you go to the dinner at the Black folks' home, it's the same thing, you know, in this culture, in this area. You know, there's things that we share in common that can bring us together for a discussion about the issues that, you know, can kind of, it's kind of keeping us from coming together. So that's one of the things that, you know, we plan on getting at and tackling, so.
That's great. I'd like to mention on the heels of what you're saying, Ms. Hudson, is that the Christiansburg Institute in Christiansburg, which is about 30 to 45 minutes from Roanoke, has been, a nonprofit has been established. They are starting to do, the Christiansburg Institute was the first African-American school in the area, started by, or not started by, but Booker T. Washington was involved at one point. So those buildings have been demolished, but there's one building left. They're trying to put it together as a museum, as a place that you're talking about, where people can come together, discussion groups, exhibits, archives. So that is happening, I think, kind of all around, which is wonderful. I'm so glad to see it.
It seems to me there's got to be an intentionality and purpose in order to have these discussions take place, because it's not something that seems to want to happen spontaneously. So what are some of the things that you have done to help make these conversations happen at your institution?
I think that's a key thing, intentional, because they're not happening on their own. So intentional, getting a group together. For example, we have this project called Stories Behind the Quilt, and where we are looking at quilting the tradition of quilting overall in the Appalachian community, and then paring it down to the tradition of quilting in the African American community. What are the commonalities? What are the differences? And even reaching into the African culture. What are the commonalities? What is the tradition? So we, in our first workshop, we had a workshop yesterday, and coming together to talk about that. And we not only shared stories behind the quilt, but stories around the table about the history and that of incidents that happened in the community and so forth. So the conversation that came out of that, I mean, it was great. And so having events that will spur the conversation and bring this conversation about, and so those are kind of things, you know, that taking place.
Thank you for that really good advice. Do we have any other questions inside of the chat that we haven't addressed yet?
I'd like to just take a short stab at that previous question. I agree. I actually thought about the term intentionality myself that you mentioned. But it does remind us the degree to which, when we think about history, we're not just talking about the past. You know, history is a constructed thing, and it's constructed in the present. And when folks have said today, you know, the degree to which they see patterns that are still present with us, I think that's absolutely true. And so when we engage, and I think part of the reasons there, to use a bad term perhaps, but there's a certain danger involved. You know, when you get the public together, you never know what the public's going to say. You never know what's going to happen. You never, you know, it's kind of out of our control. And that can be difficult in public history, say, or fields of that sort, where you're dealing so much with people in the here and now coming to confront issues. But I think it's so important that they do. And part of that has to do, I don't know if anyone's read Monuments to Absence, but it's about the Cherokee story and the ways in which the Cherokees have been memorialized within that larger Appalachian region. In no small part, the monuments are monuments to absence. And it goes to who's telling the story and what story's being told. And someone had earlier mentioned Gatlinburg, and one of the nice little pieces in this book, Monuments to Absence, is the Solly monument. If you're familiar with the character or the figure of Solly, and it's almost, Solly is almost a character of folklore in some ways. Over in Cherokee, North Carolina, if you go to the pageant or the play that's put on Unto These Hills, I think it is, you know, Solly's represented as a sort of martyred figure who sacrifices himself for the greater good of the Cherokee people as they're being removed. Historians have developed a somewhat different view about what actually happened in the events surrounding Solly's arrest and death. But nonetheless, it turns out that the monument for Solly is not over in North Carolina, where all the events surrounding his story take place. The monument was placed like in Gatlinburg. And that has to do with, at the time the monument was placed, who ended up placing it, where'd the money come from, what were the politics, you know, and all those issues of the here and now. And so history in particular is a great avenue to get people talking, but ultimately with the idea that many of the problems they're confronting are problems of the present, problems of the right now. There's another book that came to mind, The Maya of Morganton. I don't know if anyone's read that, about the chicken processing industry and immigrant labor. You know, how much are people aware, or have they been aware of the presence of immigrant labor within Appalachia? whether it's chicken processing or whether it's tobacco, which is now, of course, for most of us, a thing of the past. But the degree to which immigrant labor have played a role in how that's changing, and how are we bringing those elements of our communities into the conversation. In other words, to use a bad example, if I happen to be from Guatemala, why would I want to visit the Tipton Haynes Historic Site or Rocky Mount? What's my place? You know, what's that story? How does that story touch me? And I don't think I offered anything worthwhile, but I'll leave it at that. But I think how you incorporate the here and now is really important.
And the here and now right now is a very politicized and contentious place.
It is, which makes this work all the more important, because the stories are people's recollections. They were here. I keep going back to we were here, they were here. And the more we are able to remember in its truest sense, to put back together, to remember this idea of the people who lived here, and to continue to tell that story and remember the stories of the people who were here before, and rebuild this actual history rather than this carefully constructed history. As we remember, we make these conversations more possible, because there is a place. There is a place for all of the people who have been here and who are here now. And I believe our cultural institutions, our historic institutions, create the space for these often dangerous conversations to happen, because we house the information and the remembering of these stories and these histories. I think we are coming up on time. And I'd like to remind everybody that this is one in a series of usable paths that we do, and we invite you to the next one. But I'd also like to thank so much Tom Lee, Emily Hudson, Sherry Scarborough. You all just filled us with all kinds of information, stories that we can take away, and new insights into labor in our region and its past, as well as how it touches us right now in the here and now. Thank you so much for being here today.
Yes, thank you all. And our next event will be on August 18th. And so we would ask, hopefully, that all of you can attend that, and we'll register for that event, and hopefully as well share emails here. And let's continue this discussion between now and then. So again, this is a wonderful panel. Thank you all for being here. We really want to tell you how much we appreciate you. Also want to put out there that Dr. Nash, a colleague of Tom and I at ETSU, has put in the chat that he would like to invite everyone to a Juneteenth event at the Vance birthplace over in Weaverville on June the 18th. So you'll be able to find them on Facebook. So at any rate, thank you all.
Thank you for having us.
I appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you. Very, very great time.